Welcome, everyone. We will start just momentarily. Welcome, welcome to the College of Social Sciences Policy Pub or Pubinar. We'll be starting just momentarily. Thank you for coming. As you come in, if this is your first policy pub, welcome. This is College of Social Sciences at FSU. Tonight we have a co-sponsored policy pub being sponsored by the Institute of Politics as well as FSU. If you are new, this is our 5th year of policy pub that's sponsored by College of Social Sciences at FSU. Let me just tell you really quickly how it is set up before we begin. So what you will see is at the bottom of the side of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. What will happen is Dr. Hassel will talk for about 15-20 minutes, and then we will open it to questions. With the Q&A button, you can post a question anytime that you wish, and I will ask them during the Q&A button. If you are unable to type in your question at various points during our Q&A period, I'll just ask you to raise your hand, hit the raise your hand button, and then I'll be able to unmute your mic and you will be able to ask a question that way. So once again, it'll be about 15 minutes, 20 minutes of enlightening conversation on our topic, which is campaigns in a new environment, a retrospective into political campaigns in 2020. And then we'll have a Q&A period and we will end promptly at 6:30. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Hans Hassel. He is an associate professor in our Department of Political Science, and he's the new director of our co-sponsored institute, which is the Institute of Politics. And so he's going to talk about politics in a time of crisis and change and other realities that has made this year's national elections unlike any that we have seen before. So please help me welcome Dr. Hassel.
Thanks so much. I am, as Dina said, I'm presenting some work today about this new interesting 2020 election cycle, and it's been a lot of fun, very anxiety-ridden for many, I believe. And I think it's very appropriate now that we look back and see, what has changed. And what's different and analyze this from more of an analytical perspective. And so I'm not going to get much into the specific politics of things, but I want to think about how political campaigns were different this election cycle and what that means kind of more broadly for politics in general. So I want to start off by thinking about political campaigns and thinking about political campaign battlegrounds, thinking not specifically in terms of battleground states or competitive states, but thinking about the ground or the environment in which political campaigns take place. Campaign tactics change based on the nature of the political landscape on which campaigns are competing, right? So this is the battleground, right? If we think about a battle between two armies, right? How they complete and the tactics they use is going to depend in part upon the nature of the landscape in which they are fighting. For political campaigns, it's the same sort of thing, right? So if you have certain issues that are salient, or a certain political environment, or if you have an incumbent versus an open seat, right? All of these sorts of things change the tactics and the messaging and the process by which political campaigns, what happens in those political campaigns. So let me give you an example here. Right? So if we think about kind of one of the ones that I've mentioned here is this idea of an incumbent versus challenger race versus an open seat race. And the key kind of difference here in this battleground, and the ground on which these campaigns are fighting, is kind of the presence of a challenger, right? So when you have a challenger in the race, the incumbent has taken positions, they've taken votes, they're often well known to the public, or if they're a good representative, hopefully that they're well known to the public. They've engaged their constituency in ways that are make their name more salient, or their prominence more salient. In an open seat race, right, you don't have that. You don't have an incumbent. You don't the two people competing for the seat don't have a voting record in Congress. They may not be well known to the voting public, to citizens, and so it's a very different sort of political environment. And this is just some data I'm going to show you here on some work that I did with an undergraduate student a couple of years ago, where we collected emails from a random sample of campaigns in 100 congressional districts back in 2014. And we looked and identified whether or not there were attacks in these emails, right? So we went around to the websites of the campaigns and we signed up for emails. And we would, we entered our email address. Right? If you're a political junkie, you probably get lots of these sorts of things. Well, we asked for them. Right? We asked for these emails from over 100 congressional campaigns, excuse me, almost 200 congressional campaigns in 100 congressional districts in 2014, and we got about 1,500 of these emails, and so we went through and coded them as to whether or not there were attacks or negativity in these communications to the public. And if you look here, this is the trajectory or the arc of negativity over the course of the 9 weeks that we were receiving these emails, starting September 1 up until Election Day in 2014. And so the vertical axis here is the percent of all email campaign communications that were negative, and then the horizontal axis is the number of weeks for the election. So that every week we would measure the average number of negative emails that we received. And as you can see here, right, the arc, right, the trajectory of both of these is roughly the same, right? Challengers are more negative than incumbents overall, but the patterns here are very similar, right? You start negative 9 weeks out from the election, and as election day gets closer, both challengers and incumbents become less negative as they transition more to a get out the vote message and a variety of other things, right? So these two, there's a difference in the volume, but the trajectory or the overall arc here is very similar. However, if you look at open seat races, which is this other line here, right, you see a very different trajectory, right? The trajectory here is a campaign that starts positive and then moves more negative as the campaign progresses, before slightly receding the negativity as they also move towards the get out the vote portion of the campaign. Right, so we see here, right, the trajectories or the arcs or the patterns of these campaigns is different, right? Incumbents and challengers, their pattern is fairly similar. However, open seat candidates are very different, right? So in this case, right, we see a good example here of how political trajectories or how campaign tactics vary in response, in part, to the battleground that these campaigns are waged on. Okay, so 2020 is a weird electoral environment, right? So we've got a very polarized opinions about the president. We have a global pandemic ongoing, and early on in the political campaign, we had stay-at-home orders in almost every state. So this is a map here taken from NBC News, right? The dark pinks are places where there was a stay-at-home order issued. The light pinks are states that had partial stay-at-home orders. And then you've got a few gray states as well that didn't have any orders at all, but we're still dealing with this sort of norm of perhaps reduced engagement with voters on a variety of levels. Right. So this fundamentally changes, and many of the tactics that campaigns can engage in is going to shift their perspective and how they engage with voters and think about message. Because all of a sudden, in the middle of the campaign, you've got this different issue that's dropped into the middle of the campaign with a whole bunch of different other implications for how campaigns can actually act. And so this is a very kind of unusual process, or something that's very different from previous election cycles. So in some work that I've been doing with a graduate student here, Taylor Tuning, along with some colleagues at Northeastern and BYU Idaho, And we've been looking at how COVID actually affected campaigns. What did it change? Right? What sort of things were campaigns forced to adapt to as a result of this new political environment? And what I'm going to present or show to you today is some of that work based off of a survey that we did of congressional primary campaigns that we fielded in mid-April, right in the middle of this this pandemic and many of the stay-at-home orders. So we collected every single email address of a congressional campaign, congressional and senatorial campaign that we could find, or about 1,800 email addresses of political campaigns, congressional campaigns. And we sent out an invitation to take a survey. We received 145 responses, which is not perhaps as ideal as we would like, but it's a reasonable rate for many elite surveys. And the responses that we did get were fairly varied in terms of the partisanship. We also got a good representation of campaigns working in competitive seats versus uncompetitive seats, and a variety of other things. I should say we're also doing a variety of other things that we haven't finished collecting data on. We're looking at social media messages, and a variety of other components that we can measure actual campaign behavior, looking at fundraising and other sorts of things as well. But what I'm going to present, what I'm going to show you, wanted to show you today was sort of these initial results from the survey about how campaigns reacted to COVID and to the effects, to the events surrounding the pandemic and the emergence of the pandemic in the United States. So in this survey, we asked campaigns whether or not their campaign changed as a result of the events surrounding COVID-19. So we asked about fundraising, we asked about how they engaged voters, we asked about how they mobilized voters, whether they encouraged, if they were trying to get more people to vote absentee or not. And then lastly, whether it changed the messaging that they were using in terms of how they tried to frame themselves and their opponents. And we see large effects in each of these different areas. So we'll just kind of go through all of these, and then we can talk a little bit about how these are different. So the first thing we're looking at is fundraising. Our question was, or is the campaign doing more, less, or about the same small dollar fundraising and large dollar fundraising? So small dollar fundraising, if you don't know, is generally considered to be any sort of fundraising aimed at receiving donations of less than $250. Most of that is the email or direct mail fundraising that campaigns do, where you're targeting people that give for ideological reasons or other sorts of things. The large dollar fundraising are the events, right, where you might have a sit-down dinner or a coffee, a house party of some sort, right, where the candidate is interacting with individuals that the campaign believes that can give several $100s or even a couple of $1,000s to advance the campaign. And so what do you see here? Right, the first thing is that you see that Democrats shift, both Democrats and Republicans shift away from large dollar fundraising. All right, so in this case, right, this suggests that campaigns are relying less on these sort of social connections and are turning much more to small dollar fundraising. And you do see some shift among Democrats in small dollar fundraising, but one of the interesting things too among Republicans is that you see both less large dollar fundraising and small dollar fundraising as a result of the pandemic, right? So there is some, there's less interaction with fundraising as a result of this, right? This is something that Republicans seem to turn down. And whether this is a result of the political environment that they viewed, it's hard to say, or if this is just kind of a reaction to the difficulty of organizing and setting up events that caused them to do this. But you see a stark decline in large dollar fundraising, both among Democrats and Republicans. The next thing we asked about was how campaigns were engaging donors, voters. And what you see here, right, for Democrats, we see a very different way of engaging voters, right? Without the option of going door to door, campaigns, both Democrats and Republicans, expanded their social media presence and made attempts to interact with voters that way. We see a lot more of these virtual meetups, right, where these opportunities of engaging voters, in some other, just like we're doing right now, these sorts of gatherings where you have right, this perhaps a little bit less of a personal connection, but you are still trying to meet with them and talk with them in some way. And so we can see very clearly here that this sort of shifts the mechanism by which campaigns are engaging with voters. There's less door to door and more of these sort of social media and virtual meetups as a result. And that we might think about that might change who they're able to reach and who they're able to engage with as a result of these events here. All right, so the other thing we looked at here was voter mobilization. Is the campaign doing more, less, or about the same? And we asked specifically about absentee voter mobilization and election day voter mobilization. How campaigns approach getting voters to the polls also appears to have changed. All right, we see it very clearly among Democrats, a strong emphasis on absentee voter mobilization. There doesn't seem to be a much change in terms of their election day voter mobilization, either for Democrats or Republicans, but Democrats really do push a much stronger absentee voter mobilization as a result, and they were conscientious of this too early on, right? We see now we're aware of this sort of stark difference between Democrats and Republicans, but these campaigns were very much aware of it even in April about how they were going to approach mobilizing voters and getting them to the polls. And what's interesting here, right, is you don't see the same sort of fundamental shift among Republicans. This is probably partially due to how they approach campaigns, but you could also expect that there might be some top-down presidential influence in this process that they didn't view as much sort of bang for the buck in emphasizing these sorts of things. And then lastly, the last thing we asked is have recent events surrounding COVID-19 caused the campaign to change the message about the campaign, about the candidate, and then also to change their message about the opponent. And again, the interesting thing here is the difference between Democrats and Republicans, right? So 45% of Democrats indicated that they changed their message about their own candidate, and 40% indicated that they changed the message about the opponent, right? So you drop this new issue and this new component into the middle of the campaign, and Democrats fundamentally shifted, right? Changed the way that they were talking about the campaign and how they wanted to present themselves and their opponents. With Republicans, you don't see that. I think is an interesting difference here, is that Republicans either didn't want to take advantage of this particular new issue or felt that this issue would not be particularly helpful to them in their campaigns. And I think that's the interesting component here, is that you drop this new issue and the uptake on this, or the likelihood that they're going to fundamentally shift the way that they engage voters, may in part depend upon whether they view that kind of new information as being advantageous to their campaign or not. And it looks as though Democrats viewed the events surrounding COVID-19 as a real possibility and a potential for them, whereas Republicans, by and large, did not want to change their message, or felt that the message that they were already using was better than what they had been given. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Going back to, there's a political scientist writing in the 1960s by the name of E.E. Schatzsnyder, and he was talking about politics and viewed it, very much as a street fight. And he says, if a fight starts, watch the crowd, because the crowd plays a decisive role. And if we think about this crowd, what we're looking for is who's involved, or the scope of the conflict, and what side are they on, or what are the lines of cleavage that are dividing these groups of people that are engaged in the fight. And in the case of of this recent election cycle, COVID-19 affected both, and the events surrounding COVID-19 affected both. Right. First off, it affects the scope. Right. Who did campaigns reach out to? Who did they contact in the midst of a pandemic? Right. By fundamentally changing the methods that campaigns are using, we're changing the scope. We're seeing a different set of folks engaged as a result of who campaigns are outreaching to. Right. We see different donor targets. Right. We see an increase in focusing on small dollar donations as a result of the pandemic. We also see, a fundamental change in the lines of cleavage as a result of COVID-19. Right. What were the issues that were salient to the campaign? Right. For Democrats, that issue changed. And how did that affect where voters were ended up? Right. So we see, this fundamental shift in what Democrats thought that they could use in order to motivate and to shape the campaign in a way that would be favorable to their candidates. And we see this in terms of scope. Right, the 2020 elections saw the highest turnout rate since 1900, and the election of William McKinley. Right, so it was 66% nationwide, 72% in Florida. Right, so whether this is campaigns changing who they're contacting, part of this may be Democrats focusing more on absentee ballot methods or other sorts of things. But fundamentally, we can say that this is a unique election that has a much greater scope than it normally does. And then also, there's some evidence, perhaps, that lines of conflict changed as a result of all of this. We like I said earlier, we have an increased issue salience. We also see shifts on perceptions around the economy about which party was better at handling the economy. So this is data at the bottom here from Gallup. And as you look, beginning in basically around 2010, Republicans have consistently been viewed as being more effective on the economy, right? With the exception here of the re-election of President Obama in 2012, right? Democrats consistently have a 6 to 8 percentage point advantage over Democrats in terms of perceptions about the ability to keep the economy going in the right direction. But in 2020, right, that gap disappeared just like it did in 2012. And so maybe this is as a result of the events surrounding COVID-19, this fundamentally shifts in some way the views of voters around the issues and which side of the issues that they're on. So I think that looking back at campaigns of 2020 is a really interesting opportunity here. And I think that there's a lot to glean from these different aspects and to think about how campaigns change as a result of this new issue, and fundamentally made 2020, I think, a very different and unique year in terms of how campaigns have engaged voters and tried to pursue their message. So thanks. I look forward to the questions that we get here.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Dr. Hessel. We really appreciate your sharing some of your brand new research with us. So once again, there's 2 ways that you can participate. You can either raise your hand so that I can call on you and you can ask and unmute you so you can ask a question, or you'll see a Q&A button down at the bottom where you can type in a question. So either one of those, I can check and see if you raise your hand. I can go ahead and take your question. I also wanted to ask, since you're presenting new research, are you doing will you be following up on your survey in the future? Because I'm wondering if you're tracing out some of these changes. So does fundraising stay the same way? And some of the tactics that you
So one of the things that we're looking at right now is social media engagement by the campaign. So we're in the process of collecting all of the tweets that they sent out over the course of the campaign and trying to say, is there a difference between the volume that they sent before COVID-19 and the volume that they sent after? And also, has the message fundamentally changed as well? And then we will likely gather data as well on fundraising, right? Do we see more unitemized donations as a result of this this discontinuity between this before and after time of when this really became a big issue. Right? Do we see more sorts of attempts to move towards smaller dollar donations or other sorts of things as to how this sort of big event shifted behaviors in some way as campaigns reacted to it. So yeah.
Yeah. So Taylor asks, what do you predict the long-term effects of the high absentee voter turnout will be?
That's a good question. So most research has shown that the kind of the use of absentee balloting helps folks that vote on a regular basis to vote more regularly. So it doesn't necessarily, most of it suggests that it's not particularly good at getting people that haven't participated in the past to all of a sudden become involved again. But it is very good at creating a much more stable electorate, right? So you get folks that are usually involved most of the time, and when they move on to absentee balloting, their behavior and their participation becomes much more regular. And so I think that, in some ways, one way to think about this might be, right, how is that going to change the kind of the process of who regularly shows out, right? In some ways, you're baking in that normal base that is going to participate in every sort of election, right? So you're in some way it's going to shift the kind of how campaigns think about who they're going to target, right? They don't have to worry as much about getting those getting that base out because of absentee balloting. It's much more likely that they're going to participate. So some of my own research has shown as well that it doesn't necessarily increase turnout, but it banks votes for campaigns. And so if a campaign can bank a whole bunch of votes early on, they can then turn all of their attention and energy to perhaps some of these other less likely voters who may not participate as regularly. And so they're going to, rather than spend a lot of effort getting somebody who they think should normally turn out, but they're not sure yet if they're actually going to do it because they haven't actually done it yet, right? They can bank that vote earlier in the campaign and then focus much more of their time and energy on these sort of marginal voters or these people that are less likely to participate. So I think in terms of campaign strategy, I think it has a big effect. In terms of kind of changing the voter, kind of the typical voter, I'm not sure that that's necessarily as big. But I think it really will affect, as campaigns get better at this, they'll recognize which votes they need to bank, and then work on turning out those marginal voters much more. They'll have many more resources dedicated to that sort of marginal voter turnout at the end of the election as a result.
So Matthew asks, and he's like me, very interested in the social media component. Did the campaigns who saw an increase in social media engagement and virtual voter outreach have more electoral success than those campaigns who did not?
That's a great question. We haven't gotten that far yet, unfortunately. We can say something about the campaigns that indicated they did, and we don't have any strong results one way or the other as if their social media presence made a big difference. In talking to campaigns, their perception of social media is that it has to be integrated with the rest of the campaign, and so I think that it's probably very correlated with the campaigns that were really engaged in social media are also engaged in other places because they have the staff and a variety of other things. So I'm not sure that even if we found a correlation between engagement on social media and electoral success, that it would be as a result of social media. Right? I think that it could be just that campaigns that are engaged on social media are also the ones that have a lot more resources to begin with, and so they're doing the social media and the door knocking and the direct mail and the fundraising and all these other sort of components that make up a good campaign.
So Jeffrey wonders, did your research include finding campaign efforts to discouraging certain voters from turning out as opposed to encouraging them to turn out?
Yeah, so I have not seen a whole lot of that. Right, there's always rumors that this sort of thing happens. but my experience working on campaigns and talking to folks that still do suggests that that's not a big, it's not as big of a hype as the media tends to make it. I think that you might see, I mean, I think in some ways it's a lot like voter fraud, right? We hear a lot about it, but it may not actually be as big of a concern as people think. I think most of the time campaigns are really focused about increasing their own turnout and getting that marginal voter to the polls, or trying to convince a swing voter. I have seen very little of kind of the dedicated try to decrease the turnout of my opponents that people claim is out there. I think that part of the reason this is probably the case is that if this sort of thing came out, right, that's a really bad indicator for the campaign, and I think that they would be very hesitant about engaging in that sort of thing because of the negative ramifications. So to give you another sort of example, some of my work looks at party involvement in primary campaigns, and the formal party is very cautious about being too heavy-handed or putting their thumb on the scale, because they don't want to be seen as kingmakers or making the process anti-democratic. And I think that the same sort of thing happens with campaigns. That there's a very big risk of negative media coverage, or kind of showing their campaign in a very negative light that would be very detrimental to the campaign. And so I think when we hear a lot about it, I'm not convinced that it happens as much as we think it actually it might does. And so in some ways it's like voter fraud, right? We make a big stink out of it, but in reality, the magnitude or the impact is very small, if at all, there.
Well, and I'll ask David's question in just a second, but just related, does that have something to do with the cost? I've never looked into how much it actually costs to utilize some of these social media tools to target voters. So I'm wondering, is that fairly expensive? And that would be another sort of deterrent to, wasting your time trying to get someone else not to vote instead of spending your time trying to get your.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is it's not entirely clear, right, what that would be, right? Is it disinformation? Is it just a flood of negativity? Research on negativity and campaign negativity actually suggests that people are turned off by negative ads, but it actually doesn't have any effect on their engagement overall. They don't like it, but it doesn't affect them, and they're not less likely to turn out, right? They might say that they are, but when you actually go look at it, they actually turn out at just about the same rates. So if you send them a negative flyer or a positive flyer, and so it's really hard to say what it is that might make somebody not turn out to vote. And so I think that campaigns, one, don't want to be perceived as doing that, and two, they're not entirely sure what actually would work in that case. And the things that we often think are effective may not actually be effective. And so I think that there's the backlash concern, and then there's the concern of if we do something wrong, maybe we'll turn these people out at a higher rate, and that would be even worse. And so I think that that's part of the problem, is that there's a strong incentive not to do it, and there's not even a really good incentive to do it, I think.
Just a friendly reminder, if you'd like to raise your hand, I can call on you that way as well. So David asks, of the voters who requested a voting, a VBM, a ballot, how many vote by mail ballot, sorry, how many of them voted?
That's a good question. I don't know that. I don't know that information off the top of my head. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to look it up. There's a wonderful project. This is going to be terrible at an FSU event, but Michael McDonald at UF actually does a very good job of tracking voter turnout. And he's a really good expert on that sort of thing. And he has a website called electproject.com, and a lot of that sort of information is there. and unfortunately, he's not an FSU faculty member, but sometimes you have to recognize some good things do come out of UF, I guess.
That's true, and it is an excellent website, very helpful. So Grant wonders, the Democratic Party largely avoid knocking on doors as a result of the pandemic. Is there any indication as to how this affected turnout or voter enthusiasm?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So political science research has shown very clearly that um, that face-to-face interaction is one of the best ways to get people to turn out at the polls, right? That they react to this sort of personal communication much better than they do to a text message or to a flyer in the mail or a door hanger or any of those sorts of things. And I think that as a result, um, political campaigns um, uh, uh, they could have had a negative impact, right? Towards the very end of the campaign, you saw the Biden campaign announce that no, we were going to start doing some of this face-to-face contact, with masks, socially distanced, once they had a better sense as to what the risk of transmission was and how to mitigate those sorts of things. Um, but I suspect that there's two things working in both in this direction, right? One, this was a very polarized election where people had strong incentives to support their particular candidate as opposed to the opposition, and that increased turnout very much. Um, and I think that even though turnout has increased, I think that perhaps it could have been even higher had there been much more of a concerted effort on the Democratic side to continue with the door knocking and these face-to-face sort of interactions that we saw. And so the fact that it was the highest turnout since 1900, I think is a reflection that it could have been even higher given some of the circumstances that we had regarding some of the campaign tactics that both campaigns chose to use or chose not to use as a result of this process.
So Taylor asks, will there be increased regulation on social media campaigning in the future?
Did you guys watch the congressional hearings today? I don't know. I haven't gotten the details. So I know that CEOs of Facebook and Twitter were in front of Congress today, but I have not. Was not paying close enough attention to what was going on there to know. I mean, I think that one of the interesting things that I saw on social media was that there was sort of a shift in terms of who was advocating for more regulation or less regulation in terms of what the ability of Twitter and Facebook to regulate those sorts of components. And up until recently, Republicans have been saying, we need more regulation to ensure that there is a fair platform. We need to encourage the national government to become involved so that they don't shut out conservative voices. And now with this recognition of a Democratic administration, I think a lot of Republicans are saying, wait a second, we don't want to put the Democratic bureaucracy in charge of regulating Facebook and Twitter because they'll probably even make it even worse for us, right? And so there's this sort of concern about who's going to be doing the regulating. And so my, I think, initial reaction to Taylor's question is probably to say, I don't think that there's going to be more, at least not in the in terms of kind of the formal government regulation. I think there will continue to be social pressure and public media pressure on those institutions to change their behavior. But I think that in reality, this is a place that both Democrats and Republicans view as perhaps less regulation being better because it then doesn't hurt them when they're not in control of the regulation and making the rules surrounding the implementation of that policy at Facebook and Twitter.
But it has very interesting implications for your research. So when Facebook decides to expand its moratorium on social media campaigning, right, this affects how campaigns operate. And so we're seeing a lot of kerfuffle around Georgia, and what are the platforms going to regulate, and what will this mean for both parties to use social media platforms for outreach?
Yeah, absolutely right. You think about how changes in regulations governing campaign actions, right? Those are fundamentally about changing the scope, right? What we talked about earlier, right? Who are they able to reach? How are they engaging these individuals? And changes like this, I think, have a large impact on the ability of campaigns to engage voters, to get them to turn out and to participate, right? It changes who's watching campaigns, who's paying attention, who's protesting, who's turning out to volunteer. Right? All of these sorts of questions change. The answers to all these questions change as the environment in which, right, the battleground in which campaigns are operating fundamentally changes, right? Those tactics change, the best practices change as a result of all of these sorts of things.
Yes, definitely. So if anyone needs to raise their hand, you can go ahead and do so, and I can unmute your mic. And if anyone else wants to ask a question, please feel free to do so. I will give that a minute, and in the meantime, I want to make sure that I share with you the website information for the Institute of Politics. So you should be able to see that. Yeah, so if you want to learn more about our brand new institute that's at the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, you can navigate over to the Institute of Politics website, which is here. And of course, the college has several ways for you to keep up with the research that our students and our faculty are doing. You can come to and check out our blog, which is the Wicked Problems, Wicked Solutions blog at wicked.solutions.blog, and check out what our recent PhD students are doing, some of our alumni, our faculty research, and some great social science scholars that are undergraduates doing exciting internships. So there's a lot to see and to learn more about what we do in the classroom. You can follow us on Facebook at FSU COS, or if you prefer Instagram, you can follow us on Instagram at FSU COS. And if you're new to the pub, we do have a list. You can email Rob Nixon. He is our Director of Communication at rnixon@fsu.edu. And he will sign you up, and you will only be getting information about our pubinars, as we're lovingly calling them during the times of COVID. But you will find out what we're doing next semester, because this is our last pubinar for this semester. So feel free to just drop him a quick note, and he will put you on our pubinar emailing list for next semester. Let me see if we have any other questions or comments from the group. We do. So we have a great question following up on a previous question. What about the impact of SCOTUS? So our Supreme Court decisions. For instance, after the nomination and confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, how it affected turnout, how did it affect our voter turnout or enthusiasm? Is this something that's worth looking into?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I'm understanding that question, and if I'm misunderstanding it, please correct me. But it seems as though the question asked, right, as a result of that nomination and that confirmation, did we see any sort of difference in Republican enthusiasm or the Democratic enthusiasm in the election as a result of that, right? So it could be that a lot of the competition over between Biden and Trump was a result of the desire to control the judicial nomination process. And there have been some that I think that have suggested that perhaps perhaps Republicans were less likely to become involved after that nomination and confirmation had been secured. That maybe they said, well, we've gotten our 6-3 majority on the court now. We can be a little bit less concerned about the outcome of the presidential election because it's going to take more as a result of that. Right? It's going to take more for the Biden administration is not going to be able to reverse that in one fell swoop. It's unlikely that he's going to be able to pack the courts because of the need for Senate nominations and so on and so forth. I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. I would be doubtful that people are that sophisticated and that aware of issues and to see that it actually had a really big impact on turnout or enthusiasm among Democrats and Republicans. I mean, I suspect that most people were not paying close attention to the confirmation hearings. Most people don't know who Merrick Garland is. Most people aren't aware of those sorts of details about political life. And I suspect that the reason for increased turnout is largely because of the polarized political environment that we have, and that's what's driving it. And I'm not sure that that the changes on the court or the securing of a safe conservative majority on the court really had that much of an effect on conservative voters. Maybe a slight marginal effect, maybe, but I suspect that that most people are not aware of who she is and what she stands for and her positions on the court. I think that for me, who's constantly engaged in politics, I know who these Supreme Court judges are. I know who Mitch McConnell is. I know who Susan Collins is. The average person has no idea who their member of Congress is, or who the sitting Supreme Court justices are, or who the Secretary of State is, or those sorts of things. And I think that most people are not aware of the details, that level of detail of politics. And so I suspect that turnout, while may have affected a small group of folks, is probably not the main driver for the election outcome. I think that the 4 or 5 percentage points would be an absolutely huge amount to contribute to. I would suspect if there is an effect, it would be on the margins of 0.1% at most overall.
Oslam said that was exactly what she was asking and says thank you for getting her question right. Grant asks, does any of the preliminary data so far indicate that the 2020 election was more like two incumbents running against each other rather than a challenger versus an incumbent, since President-elect Biden has been such a prominent figure over the course of the Obama presidency?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think that part of it is when you look at an incumbent versus challenger election, part of it is knowing who the person is and seeing their knowing what they stand for and what they're doing or what they would do in a variety of different circumstances. So part of that, part of the key aspect of an incumbent challenger election is the kind of the knowledge about those two particular candidates and their positions and their stances and so on and so forth. The other aspect of an incumbent challenger election is the ability to place blame for certain recent outcomes that people are aware of at the feet of the incumbent. And that I don't think is you can't do that to a challenger because they're not in office. And so in that case, Vice President Biden is not, you can't consider him an incumbent in that sense. Or maybe you can make a stretch and say, no, the Obama administration policies are a result of, have resulted in X, Y, and Z, and that's not particularly good, but he's still able to say, well, that was part of the Obama administration. I think this was something early on in the primary campaign where someone accused him of taking all the credit for all the wonderful things that the Obama administration had done, but accepting none of the blame for any of the things that the Obama administration had done bad or that people were criticizing them for. So I think that there's still that ability for him to separate from the Obama administration. And he also hasn't been in office for 4 years, and so some of those more recent policies are a little bit different. And I mean, the other thing about presidential campaigns, I think, are very different than congressional campaigns, just because even a challenger is well known at the presidential level, right? Everybody knows who Joe Biden is. Right? Everyone knew who Hillary Clinton was, even though she wasn't in office. Right? So these sort of knowledge about those individuals is very salient, whereas at the congressional level, that's often not the case. And so perhaps some of the differences between challenger and incumbent at the congressional level may not necessarily apply at the presidential level, because both of those candidates are well known. Right? They're different types of races. They're different types of battlegrounds that the contests are being fought on. A congressional race is very different than a mayoral race, than a senatorial race or a presidential race. Right? All of those have different attributes and aspects that make different aspects salient.
So Jeffrey, if I'm hopefully I'm interpreting his question correctly. Jeffrey wonders, will the campaign strategies change dramatically once COVID is gone? So do you expect to see a big shift in some of these campaign tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that what happened this election cycle will inform future election cycles. Political campaigns have a tendency to repeat what was effective in the previous election cycle. If they found something that worked well, they continue using it, and other campaigns quickly adopt it. Right. So if you look back to the beginnings of the Republican GOTV efforts back in the early 2000s, right, their 72-hour plan has been it was quickly adopted by Democrats, right? And you've got NGP Van now, right, on that side, right? They both have these these new technologies that they invented 2 decades ago are now very commonplace among both campaigns. And so I suspect a lot of the things that they found effective this election cycle will actually carry forward in future election cycles. They will continue to get better at social media. I would not be surprised to see more sort of virtual meetings with donors or voters as a way of trying to get candidates in multiple places at once, especially in large congressional districts or in large states. It allows a candidate to cover both sides of Montana, or it allows a candidate to cover both sides of Florida if they're running for Senate, right? To be in multiple places at once without necessarily having to travel to those different areas, right? So you even look at Congressman Neil Dunn's district right now, right? That stretches from Jacksonville out to Panama City, right? That's a 4-hour drive essentially, and right. So these sorts of things might enable and might help. I would suspect the campaigns will continue to use a lot of the things that they figured out this election cycle in the future as a way of mobilizing and engaging and doing a variety of other things that they have found to be effective.
So Matthew asks, did you look at which specific social media platforms campaigns focus more attention on? So for example, did they spend more on Facebook or Twitter?
That's a good question. I have not looked at that. I think that most campaigns recognize the need to be on all of them, and I think you have some campaigns that will only focus on one because that's where they have a platform and a following. But most, I think, so in the collecting of this data, we looked at Facebook and Twitter, and almost everybody had both of those. And often what you'd see is that the posts would be the same post on both sides. And occasionally you'd have a candidate who would be more active on one, or active on another. But in general, if they're posting to social media, right, there are enough social media tools that allow you to essentially control your entire social media platform with one app or something like that. So you're doing the same sort of posts in a variety of different places. And I think that the campaigns recognize that they need to be active in all of those in order to reach all the voters, right? Because the people that are on Facebook, your grandparents are going to be different than the news folk that are on Twitter and the college students that are on Instagram, right? Those are different, different groups of folks that are in these different platforms. We've seen some. This is more your research, but you've seen some uptake in Snapchat and a variety of other platforms as well. And so I think that I think campaigns are just saying we've got to hit them all and make sure that we're reaching as many folks as we can on whatever platform they happen to be on, so that we can communicate with them. And I think a lot of campaign efforts are about capturing the attention and then being able to utilize those individuals for their campaign. I think a lot of their efforts on social media are not necessarily about persuasion, but are aiming at making sure that they can communicate with folks. and are and can capture them to use them in the campaign in some way. So I remember talking to one Republican operative who was in charge of the NRCC's digital platform, and his comment was, "No, this is not about persuasion. This is about identifying people and being able to recognize how we can communicate with them, whatever that platform is. When we recognize that the people that we get on Facebook are going to be different than people we get at Twitter, and those are going to be different than the people that we're able to reach door to door. And so, all of this sort of thing should then merge into one database where we can say, okay, we want to communicate with this person to get them to volunteer. Here's the best way to do that, right? Here's where we've reached them before. Here's where they've communicated with the campaign or some other campaign previously, and this is how to do that.
And what I love about it, of course, is that social media is so unpredictable. So then there's citizens using social media for their own purposes to disrupt or take over campaigns, and how campaigns have to figure out how to respond to these moments. So the TikTok moment, or whatever it is at that particular
Yeah.
time. But it is a fascinating area of research, and I look forward to seeing more.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. If you think about right, if you think about media as the traditional gatekeepers for information, right, that's changed, right? It's no longer the newspapers and the TV stations that are providing access to voters and communicating. And so campaigns are, I think, adapting to trying to get their message directly to voters in ways that they didn't before. They realize that the message that may have been effective for getting through the gatekeepers on media is different than the message that's going to be effective at rallying folks on Twitter or Facebook or social media or whatever the platform may be.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I don't see any more questions, and we only have a couple minutes left, so this is a great time to end our pub. And I would like to thank you, Dr. Hans Hassel, our new director of the Institute of Politics, for talking through his very interesting research with us. I would like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us and learn more about the exciting research that's happening at Florida State University and within the college. Again, please feel free to email Rob Nixon to get on our list. And we have a great reminder in the chat. We have a YouTube station, which I need to add to my slides. So you'll be able to see all the videos that we have, including this one tomorrow, on our YouTube channel. So you can copy that down from the chat. Otherwise, thank you again. I hope that you all have a wonderful and safe holiday, and we will see you in 2021. Thanks. Bye, everyone.